Okay, we're going to take a few minutes of comments, questions from the audience and other panelists, if you wish. Please.
Well, this will not be the first time I've disagreed with President Carter. First of all, I'm not sure that that's precisely what he said, although Alan Dershowitz has told me that's the, in effect, title of his book. I would certainly have to read it, but if it takes that position, I would certainly strongly disagree with it, and I've disagreed with many of the positions he's taken, particularly since he's left government.
In terms of Pollard's how can you compare Pollard's sentence of lifetime compared to Dean Stewart, who committed the treason, got 2 years?
I think that you can make legitimate comparisons about the treatment that Pollard got relative to those of other spies. No one has ever seen, to my knowledge, outside of a very select few, the famous Weinberger memorandum, which in effect undercut the plea bargain that was reached. What I can say, however, is the point that I did make, which is getting beyond the actual sentence. What Pollard did and what Israel did to recruit him was an extraordinarily serious breach with very long-lasting impact. And that, to me, is a much more important issue than whether or not he should have been given something less than life imprisonment.
Nat Lewin?
Well, one of the shortcomings of this panel maybe is that we are a mutual admiration society, and all four of us think very highly of each other, I think. Stewart is a very committed and proud and affirmative Jew, and although he protests very loudly that all the things he did in government were very neutral, it was obvious to everybody during all that time that Stuart Eizenstat was someone who was sympathetic in terms of Israel and in terms of Jewish causes. The fact is, as a litigator, I find that litigating for religious Jewish groups, the worst judges, the judges I'm most unhappy about getting, are Jewish judges. They generally lean over backwards to show that they will not rule for a Jewish group, Jewish religious group. Specific things I can think of, I've been told, for example, that it was Stewart who very simply and quickly agreed and arranged for the first menorah to go up on the lawn on the mall in Washington, D.C., when that question was presented to him. Is that true?
That is true. In fact, there's a rather humorous story, if I may interject. Rabbi Shem Tov, representing the Lubavitch movement, came to me and said that Cecil Andrus in the Interior Department had rejected their license to erect a giant menorah in Lafayette Park across from the White House, and I asked him the grounds that had been given, and he said, well, it was a church-state issue. And so I called Andrus up and I said, what's the basis for this? And he said, well, it's public land, it's a religious symbol, it's a violation of the First Amendment. And I said, well, how about the licenses you issue for the Christmas tree on the ellipse? And he said, well, that's not a religious symbol, it's a secular symbol. And I said, Cecil, go back to your lawyers and come up with a different answer. I'll go to Carter, you're going to lose, you don't want to publicly be humiliated.
But we consistently, when we have menorah litigation, and I have several cases every year, the American Jewish Congress, I don't know whether Mark Stern is still in the audience, has not given up its opposition to having menorahs in public places.
Nor have I.
Nor have you. And the worst news is when a Jewish judge gets that case. There are very few Jewish judges with whom we've succeeded. We've succeeded with virtually every non-Jewish judge, I think, before whom that issue has been presented. So the notion that, I mean, I'm sure, and I will ask Stewart whether it's not true in his experience within the federal government, that he has encountered Jews in high places who have not had the affirmative attitude towards Jewish issues that he has expressed and implemented during his years.
Yes, obviously there are some who bend over backwards, but I think that by and large Most Jews, again, don't try to check their backgrounds at the door. Increasingly, that's the case. I think that if you look at FDR's staff, there were major Jews on his staff. Benjamin Cohen was one of his closest advisors. The chairman of the House International Relations Committee was Jewish. I think that the times have changed. In those days, there was a reluctance, Nat, to raise your head above water. I think that's less the case now, but there is a fine line between being sensitive to Jewish causes and being an advocate for them. And that's a line that has to be very carefully drawn when you're in a senior position in an administration.
Alan?
My dear friend Nat, I think, has picked the worst possible example of a Jewish judge ruling against a menorah. I'm certainly not a self-hating Jew. I certainly don't check my Judaism at the door, and if I were a judge, I'd rule against menorahs in public land, and because I think it's bad for America, bad for Jews, bad for the separation of church and state. I think there are so many different ways in which a Jew can have his decisions influenced, but reasonable people on this panel disagree about menorahs on the lawn. But the question I wanted to ask Stuart relates to this, and that is, you're concerned appropriately that the Pollard case gives rise to dual loyalty. But isn't it true that the only people ever accused of dual loyalty are the Jews? A Polish government would never think of not hiring a Polish American. An Egyptian government would never. It's how much weight do we give the bigotry of people like Walton Mearsheimer in making our decisions, or do we act, and again, it's not a perfect example because what Pollard did is inexcusable, but as Jews, how much do we act if we think principle pushes in one direction, but because there are bigots out there, it's the same question I put to Panina in a different way, we have to tailor doing the right thing because of fear that bigots will react in the wrong way?
Well, as I said in my closing remarks, the worst response to the canard of dual loyalty is to be cowed by it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's very important that Jews in public life take positions, principled positions, whether it's in favor of Israel or other causes that happen to be favored by the Jewish community, without fear that they're going to be tainted by the notion of dual loyalty. And that certainly would be the worst reaction. But again, I want to try to come back to my original point. There are in every White House, and that's the way they're structured, a outreach person who is the outreach person to the Hispanic community, the black community, the Jewish community, the labor community, to the business community. Their job is to be an advocate for that community to the White House as much as it is to explain the White House position to those groups. But I can tell you that those people's views are completely discounted. I mean, it's known that that's what they're there for. They are, in effect, filters and conduits for that position. They play a useful role, but in terms of having a senior policy-making position, there's no way that you're going to listen because you know where they're coming from. In the same way, by the way, that, on a minimum wage issue, when the AFL-CIO comes in to see you, where they're going to come out, where the Business Roundtable is going to come out when they come to see you, and they each have their own data about the impact on unemployment, and the ripple effect on inflation, and you take that into account and you discount it, realizing that they are advocates for their position. So there is a distinct difference, I would say, Alan, between being an advocate for Jews within an administration and being sensitive to Jewish causes within an administration. And to the extent that you are seen as an advocate, then your position will be discounted in the same way it is if an external group comes in.